give it a gavel and everybody will listen.
No, you're fine.
Good afternoon, members. I'd like to call the Finance, Ways and Means Committee to order for February 23rd, 2021. Chairman Hazelwood is presenting a bill, so you've got a substitute teacher for just a few minutes. Not enough time to get into any trouble. Mr. Clerk, please call the roll.
Representatives Campbell, Camper, Crawford, Faison, Freeman, Gantz, Garrett, Gillespie, Hawk, Hicks, Lamar, Lamberth, Lynn, Miller, Ogles, Sexton, Shaw, Sparks, Todd, Whitson, Williams, Wendell, Zachary, Vice Chairman Vaughn.
Here.
Chairman Hazelwood. Vice Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you, and let the record show that Representatives Gillespie and Whitson are excused. Today we've got two presentations. The first one's going to be relatively brief from the Department of Human Services. They're going to be presenting us with two expansion requests, and then we'll follow that up with a budget presentation by the Department of Education. So I would like to remind the members that your budget documents are on the dashboard of your iPads for you to refer to. And without objection, I would like to I'd like to move out of session and call the Department of Human Services up and Director Carr. And for the record, please introduce yourselves as you begin.
Mr. Chairman and substitute teacher and members of the committee, my name is Clarence Carter. I'm the still very new commissioner of the Department of Human Services. Today is day 31, but who's counting? And I'm here today to present two expansion requests for your consideration. The first is for our child care certificate. As you are well aware, with the pandemic spending and additional federal dollars made available, we have come to the very end of spending authority, which was $233.8 million for our child care certificate program, and we're requesting an expansion of $175 million, and it is to meet all of our child care obligations through the end of this fiscal year. So I submit that for your consideration.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the members? Representative Williams.
Thank you. Day 30 something. Welcome back, Commissioner. I did have a couple questions for you.
Yes, sir.
One of the big challenges I heard in my district, in particularly with this expansion and extension of child care services, that sometimes we were having difficulty getting back to those child care facilities with reimbursements in a timely fashion. I don't know, have you been able to look into that, or are we doing better? I recognize we have lots of new paperwork from the federal government we have to do as it relates to that. But the question was, typically that was taking 30, 45 days longer than it normally had. Didn't know if you could give us an update on that process and how we were doing there.
We have addressed all issues of expeditious payment, and this request will actually help us continue to stay in line with the expeditious payments to our providers.
Okay.
And without this, those payments would be disrupted.
Okay. Just a follow-up.
Sure.
As it relates to our child care facilities, obviously frontline workers and first responders, healthcare providers, those were giving preferential treatment by the federal government in the expenditure of these dollars.
That's correct.
Have you seen a closure or a shrinkage at all in child care facilities, or have you been able to see any expansion of those whatsoever based upon these additional dollars?
During the height of the pandemic, about 50% of our child care providers closed during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
We are back up to 80% pre-COVID providers at this juncture.
Okay, thank you very much.
Chairman Hawk.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Carter, great to see you
It's
again.
good to see you again.
Looking forward to our work together on, and this question may have been answered and you may have mentioned it. The two expansions we're looking at, are there state dollars involved or all these acceptance of federal dollars that we're working
This
through
is
now?
100% acceptance of federal dollars.
Okay. Is it up to this dollar level that we're spending, or is it we're spending all of that?
We anticipate spending all of this authority by the end of the fiscal year.
All right,
All this
Commissioner.
extended authority.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Look forward to our work together. Thank you,
you.
Chairman Ball.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, if not, then Commissioner Carter, we appreciate your comments and answering our questions. Yes,
And so there's a second extension request.
okay,
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay. This is an expansion request for our SNAP program. Our initial spending authority, we will be out of that authority by the middle of March. And so we are requesting an additional $650 million in expanded spending authority. And again, that's 100% federal dollars, but it is to meet all of our SNAP obligations, our pandemic SNAP obligations, and our regular SNAP obligations.
Okay, any questions about the second expansion request? SNAP dollars. Okay, Leader Lambert.
Thank you, Chairman and Commissioner. Thank you for being here. I know that there are some different bills that are out there dealing with SNAP benefits and how folks can take advantage of both TANF dollars and SNAP benefits. Would this expansion be affected by that legislation at all, or is it outside of that?
It's all outside of that. These are obligations that would exist within the existing construct.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to clarify that and make sure. Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, then Representative Lynn.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask, will this decrease the available dollars for the bills that are out there?
Again,
So sort of the opposite question.
now what this will do is this will enable us to meet existing obligations as the law, regulation, and policy currently exists.
Mhm. But does it decrease our balance so that it affects the legislation that's out there might have a lower balance to draw from on those TANF dollars?
This is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and doesn't speak to the temporary assistance needy families
okay.
balance at all.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, if not, then Commissioner Carter, we appreciate your comments and answering our questions. Our next,
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much.
thank you for coming. Our next presentation will be from the Department of Education. We're going to hear an expansion request by them, and I'll invite them to come up. After the expansion request, we'll have an opportunity to ask them questions, and then we're going to hear their formal budget hearing after the expansion request. Commissioner Schwinn, I'll ask you and your guests to announce themselves for the record, and then you're free to get started.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So Penny Schwinn, Commissioner of Education at the Department of Education.
Sam Piercy, Deputy Commissioner of Operations.
Charlie Bufalino, Assistant Commissioner of Policy and Legislative Affairs.
Drew Harpool, Assistant Commissioner of Finance.
Okay, wonderful. So we are going to start, as we always do, our strategic plan, our 3 priority areas around academics, whole child, and educators. That continues to be the 3 bucket areas from which we are thinking about and strategizing for funding. However, today we are going to focus on our federal relief funding, and quite a bit coming in from the feds. And so wanted to be able to take a minute to walk through what you can expect, what has happened, and certainly what this means for public education. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, but first and foremost, we have ESSER and GEAR 2.0. We received 1.0 in the late spring, early summer of last year. In late December, a bill passed for a second round of funding that came to Tennessee in our coffers in early January, and we essentially have 12 weeks to disperse that to districts. It's $1.1 billion under ESSER 2.0, so that's the K-12 set aside. And then there's an additional $100 million for GEAR, which is the governor's discretionary set aside. Of the $1.1 billion, 90% goes directly to LEAs, 10% is reserved for the SEA level state set aside. The Congress has been very clear that they would like that money to be emphasized towards facilities and for learning loss. GEAR is discretionary, although there is a federal requirement that a certain percentage be set aside for private schools. The rest is discretionary funds, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. In terms of important notes, especially thinking about our districts, they are under a lot of stress right now. There are a lot of plans from this federal relief. It can only be around a compliance check. The allowability for these funds expires September 30th of 2023. That means districts have, in essence, 2.5 years to spend down this funding. On October 1st, it goes back to the federal government. And then from a reporting perspective, this is very different from the first round. The federal government would like much more regular and transparent reporting at the state and the district level. So you'll expect monthly monitoring and reporting from districts that will then be put on our website. The same will go for the state education spending and drawdowns, and that will also be posted regularly at the federal government level. In terms of the actual money, want to just kind of recap from ESSER 1.0 and ESSER 2.0. We're going to report on those together so you can see the biggest pot of money and how it all gets allocated. This is just for the state set aside. Again, the district that goes to districts, they get to decide how they spend the funding as long as it is aligned to federal law, which means it is used for COVID relief purposes. Emphasis on facilities and learning loss. For the department, we've got $12 million set aside for Reading 360 from last round. Innovative high school models, those are grants directly to districts at $11.6 million. Educator supports and endorsements, that's to support educators with additional learning opportunities so they can have endorsements to support students. And then we had a number of online resources during the summer for the pandemic to support schools and districts and certainly families. Moving into ESSER 2.0, which is the round of funding that we just received. We have $3.5 million going towards literacy. That's to support additional initiatives from the Literacy Success Act that was just passed. $2 million set aside for PBS. That continues the partnership with PBS, specific supports for literacy and other initiatives that they would like to have in support of our students during the pandemic. So want to put aside $2 million for them. And then $5 million for advanced coursework. We saw a significant uptick in the number of high school students who participated in online AP and rigorous dual enrollment classes during the pandemic. That does cost money. We want to be able to fund those courses without it having a financial impact for districts. So this amount would fund 15,000 courses to be taken for advanced coursework for students in an online format. Next, for long-term needs for the department, we would like to set aside $47 million to invest in the Tennessee All-Core. That was part of the bills that was passed during special session. This would provide very small group frequent tutoring for students across the state, matching grants for districts, and then for nonprofit partners to provide that tutoring. That's in groups of 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 for student-to-teacher ratios. But again, these are matching grants. So all of these funds go out to districts and partners to be able to provide that tutoring for students across the state. We've also talked a lot about the educator pipeline. About 1/3 of our teachers are retirement eligible. We don't have enough folks who are in the pipeline to be able to replace those who may leave over the next 5 to 7 years. This is $20 million to get in front of that, to bring more people into the pipeline and ensure every student has a qualified teacher in front of them every day. And then last are systems improvements, $20 million. That's a lot more districts and students on computers now, so we need to make sure that we're investing in those supports. In terms of some final numbers, we have math. We have a math adoption coming up in 2023. So this would support additional resources for math adoption for districts. Innovative assessments also were in the special session bill. So we want to make sure that we are providing additional supports there. And then a policy and legislative support tool. That's a tool to help with public transparency. You all pass bills, and we want to make sure that you all have resources to point to for the public to be able to see, here's what the bill says and does, here are updates, ways to engage, et cetera. So that is a resource we'll be talking to all of you about to get feedback and develop something that's going to be helpful so you can track and see how your bills are implemented. And then the last part is we have half side is almost exclusively for support with reporting and monitoring. That's our responsibility against the funds. A little bit for accountability and codification. Again, those are internal operational needs in order to administer a grant of this size. For gear spending, so this is the governor's set aside portion. We're looking at a recap of that funding. So what we have spent and will continue is the Reading 360, $34.5 million for Reading 360. Innovative High Schools and a free ACT prep course. So those are going to be the planning grants for high schools and for LEAs. New charter grants at $5 million. That was announced just earlier this week. Mental health resources at 2.25, and then the civic seal that he talked about in the state of the state at 500,000. That's year 2 of that program. There was also $14 million to support additional organizations who are typically funded in the budget, but given cuts last year, we wanted to make sure there was continuity of services for districts. That $14 million essentially allowed those organizations to continue for this year for consideration in the budget. In terms of gear, I want to be very, very clear about what the federal law says. $100 million went to the gear pot. Unlike the last time, the federal government has set out in the federal law. What ends up happening is the department by law is required to work with private schools to determine which schools want to participate and which schools do not want to participate. We go through an entire process related to that. Those schools that do participate get their share of this funding. Any schools that do not want to participate, that money goes back to the governor's discretionary pot. So $72 million is the max amount given our private school enrollment that could go to private schools. We're actually seeing now that we're on the other side of that process that just about 45% of that will end up being dispersed. It could be up to 55%, but not every private school wanted to participate. So this means in general, we'll have an additional $35 million approximately on top of what you are seeing here. So it will be about $60 million, just maybe a little bit above for governor discretionary. The rest by law goes to private schools. In terms of planned projects from the governor's discretionary pot, mental health in schools, so investing $10 million. Those are grants directly to districts to support mental health in our schools and districts. $11 million for a charter school consortia, and then an incubator, so that would be 1 and 10 respectively. Facilities sustainability programs, that's for our very small districts. A lot of them are getting funding, but they might not have enough to close the gap for a major facilities project. This would essentially be smaller grants in the neighborhood of $100,000 to $500,000 to help our smaller districts be able to do bigger projects. We also have some additional set aside for the ASD priority schools and state special schools. There are a lot of facilities work that needs to happen specifically. And then potentially a civics education investment. Again, that will depend on how much of the private school funding goes to private schools versus back to the discretionary pot. And then just a quick preview on ESSER 3.0. So the great irony is that plans are due March 15th. March 15th is also the expected date where another federal stimulus will likely go to the president's desk for signature. There's a lot of conversation about the federal relief funds right now. None of that seems to be centered on education. That does seem like the $130 billion national investment in K-12 relief 3.0 is very likely to pass in some format. It got through the House last week. It will now be at the Senate. Within that package, the state of Tennessee will likely see, if they fund it the same way they have for the last two, somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.3 to $2.6 billion on top of what I just covered. So that's an additional pot of funding, same formula. 90% of that $2.3 to $2.6 billion would go to our LEAs, 10% set aside for the department. Half of that would need to be used for learning loss at the state level, and then 20% would need to be used for learning loss at the LEA level. So those are some of the changes. It is distributed by income, so Title I. It is not the same per pupil across the state. So District A, and I'm going to use one example, so you're likely going to see a district that has a higher income in terms of the families and students enrolled will get less per student than those who have a high Title I percentage, will get more per student. That's part of the federal formula. That's what we saw in ESSER 1.0, and it's what we will see in ESSER 3.0. So not all districts will get the same per pupil. I'm going to pause there to see if there's any questions. It's a lot of information and a lot of dollars, and so happy to answer any questions you might have. Before I move on.
Thank you, Commissioner. We do have a couple of questions. Chairman Faison.
Thank you, Madam Chair, I have two questions, if that's with your permission. Thank you.
Two quick
All right,
questions.
first question, Commissioner, very good to see you.
Nice to
Hope
see
you're doing
you.
well.
Yes, sir.
I have seen on a lot of social media, and I have friends at home who've reached out to me. There was an article in a publication, Tennessee Education Report,
Okay.
and they were saying we're incredibly underfunded compared to many other states. Our BEP is very underfunded. There was also a portion of the article says that there's $3 billion available to Department of Ed. And I would like to be able to have a conversation with my educators at home because they feel like we're so underfunded. And I just wanted, from your perspective, how far are we underfunded that? What are we doing to fix it? What is the trajectory moving forward? Can you give me some reason that I can say, all right, here's the truth, or the other side of the story, the Paul Harvey side of the story of that Tennessee Education Report?
So sure, I think there's a few questions in there. So I'd say on the $3 billion, that's likely talking about the ESSER 1.0, 2.0, and potentially 3.0. We administer the funds, but like I said, 90% of that goes out to LEAs automatically. So that's not, the Department of Education doesn't have that funding. That all goes to LEAs. And like I said, that is completely discretionary funding as long as it's tied to COVID. So all the money that you're hearing about right now goes to LEAs by federal law. In terms of kind of investments, I will just note we are in a lawsuit around the BEP, so I'm gonna provide a little bit of information, but we'll stop short of any kind of commentary. Over the last decade, we've added approximately as a state, I believe, $1.4 billion to public education in the last 10 years. And I think when you're hearing comments like the ones I think you just shared with me, it's about local additional spending. For the actual BEP, it's a formula. That formula has been fully funded for the last 23 years by law. So we run a formula, we produce the amounts from that formula, and that is what the law suggests that we must do, and that is what we do. Anything that might be coming, and I have not read the article, anything that might be coming through that article would probably be talking about local additional funding. And those are all additional funding decisions that are made at the local level. But the formula itself is actually dictated through statute, and we run that formula and fully fund that formula.
Madam Chair. So as it deals with how we fund, the article that I read that they're asking me is they're saying we're incredibly underfunded compared to other states. And that's where I was, are we really underfunded? This is something, obviously, I know since we've been here, we put over $1 billion in the last 10 years that I've been here. But my question is are we really that far down behind states all around America?
So, I think I would have to see which ranking that particular article was looking at. I think there are 10 to 20 plus different ways in which we're ranking states and where states fall. Traditionally, Tennessee is in the bottom quarter in terms of those rankings. Now, that does not necessarily include cost of living and certain things. So if you're comparing that to New York City and a rural community, very different costs of living. So I wouldn't know exactly what the calculations were for each of those, but traditionally, that's how state rankings have fallen.
Chairman Hawk.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I hope you've caught your breath as you've come back in the room. So I just want to make sure we're talking about your budget expansion request right now, and then we're going to get to your budget in a few moments. Is that correct, Madam Chair? Okay. As we're on your budget expansion that you just presented to us, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
And you may address this later on in your presentation about the budget document itself, but are there any federal dollars or any dollars in there as we're looking at student populations? We may have, students may have gone out of the existing school system into homeschools or to other venues, and there is concern, not only short-term, and you and I have had this conversation at West Green High School, as a matter of fact. So
Yes, sir.
are there any provisions in these dollars we're talking about for a hold harmless provision, or will we hear about that later in the budget presentation?
So that's a great question. You'll hear about it in both. So for the purposes of this presentation, I can talk about congressional intent of the relief funds. So congressional intent of the relief funds, like I said, emphasizes learning loss in facilities. That's what they would like states to spend money on. And by states, I mean the districts set aside as well as the states. However, On top of that, there is an expectation that part of these funds are relief funds, which would be some of the gaps between what is traditionally funded and maybe what is funded. And that would be some of the hold harmless you're talking about. That is intended by Congress for these funds to also cover. That does not in any way talk about kind of the governor's proposed budget, which of course we are very supportive of, which certainly says that a hold harmless for districts, that funding is set aside at the state. That is also, frankly, a legacy that you all have had over time, and you certainly had last year in terms of funding our districts, which is important. Yes, sir.
Representative Shaw.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, sir.
I just heard this report this morning, and I don't know how true it is. In the CARES Act money, that charter schools are getting, pupils are getting like $1,000+ more than public school students. Can you address that and why so?
So in Tennessee, that would be completely the district's discretion. So I'm going to say one thing at the national level and then Tennessee specific. In some states, charter schools are their own LEAs. And so they're going to get funding just like a traditional district based on their income, the Title I percentage. In Tennessee, our charter schools are not their own districts, so they actually are under an authorizer district. In the case of CARES, it is very clear and specific that the money is the applications from districts. The money goes to the district. The LEA makes decisions on how they allocate that funding. I'll give an example from the First Act in two completely different districts. One district decided to do district-wide spending and then divide up funding by charter school, and all of the charter schools in that district in this state got different per pupil amounts. In another district, they allocated the same per pupil to charter schools as they did to their other schools. It totally depends on the LEA. They get to make the decision on how much each charter school receives because the money goes to the LEA. The state nor anyone else is able to dictate or direct where that funding goes, side of to the LEA.
Go ahead.
Thank you. One more question. But do you know why the LEAs make that decision to do this? My question is, if we in the process of learning, of
Sure.
helping kids, I mean, why would we make that much difference, especially when we know chartered schools operate under one set of rules and public schools on another? I'm just trying to figure out why would we make that much difference be made in pupil ratio when it comes to the money?
So I wouldn't be able to answer that. I certainly would recommend if there's a specific LEA and how they determine that funding. I can't think of an LEA in our state that has put more money aside to charter schools than they would for their traditional schools. That's not something that I'm familiar with, but I'd be happy to look at a specific case if there's one that you have in mind.
Representative Lamar.
Thank you, Chair Lady. How you doing, Commissioner?
Doing well.
Just
How are you,
a couple
ma'am?
of quick questions, and I'm just going to ask them all together. One, is any of this money tied to having to be mandated to go to school in person? Second question is, in the fiscal year 22 request, you have 124.7 million non-recurring for the summer learning programs. Are these one-time programs? How is this money going to be allocated out to LEAs? And will it cover all the LEAs and the students? And then you have literacy for 1 million reoccurring. Is that enough for literacy programs? Just $1 million for statewide? And then also you're investing.
Representative Lamar, if I could stop you, I think it's very difficult for our presenter to answer multiple questions like that and just keep up with the questions. So if we could let her answer the ones that you've asked and then go from there.
Sure thing,
Commissioner.
Chair Lady.
Great. So there is no requirement in either ESSER 1.0, 2.0, and it does not look like that will be required in 3.0 for an in-person. There's nothing tied to it except that the money has to go for COVID relief for K-12 schools. In terms of summer programming, I think we'll spend a little bit more time talking about it when we get to the budget requests. But essentially what you are seeing is that we have the request for this summer. It's a special session part of the budget, and that is to fund essentially what was outlined in the special session bill. The $1 million for literacy is for additional staff to support. It is not for programs. I think that Literacy Success Act that was passed during special session is about the policy framework and policy direction. The additional $1 million is for staffing support to ensure that we can actually implement implement the bill. We've partnered that with what you see in the budget expansion that I presented on around Reading 360 and additional investments that we are using our set aside from the federal government to support the Tennessee Literacy Act and make it even bigger. So that's a little bit of what we're hoping to do with the funds. Yes, ma'am.
And my last question is, I saw there was 500,000 for a legislative tracker or things like that. So can you kind of explain what we're trying to do with that?
Yeah, sure. So something that I think I have heard from many of you in my conversations is the same question, just different bills. So it is, we passed this bill. What have you done about it? How far has it gone? What's the implementation? I have people in my community who want to get involved. How would they do that? But lots of questions on bill implementation and how we communicate statutory language to the public. So hearing that from so many of you over the last 2 years, we wanted to develop a place on our site where once you pass legislation, we would have a plain spoken way to say, this is what was passed. Here's what it means. Here's who's impacted by it. Here's the fiscal note. And then if you want to be involved or engaged, here are opportunities to be engaged, because there's often lots of those and not a centralized place to communicate it. And then tracking how the implementation's going over time so that you don't have to have those same conversations with your constituents in the same way. There's a place where you can point to and say, let's talk about this information. So it's hopefully addressing some of the feedback that we've heard over the last couple of years. Yes, ma'am.
Chairman Hicks.
Thank you, Chair Lady and Commissioner. It's certainly good to see you
Nice
and
to see
your
you.
team here. Just to make sure, so ESSER 1.0, let's talk about the total amounts of all these funds. So ESSER 1.0, and tell me if I'm wrong.
Yes, sir.
$259 million from ESSER 1.0. ESSER 2.0 is $1.1 billion. GEAR 1.0 is about $63 million, and GEAR 2.0 is about $100 million. Is that pretty accurate?
Yes, sir.
And then it looks like ESSER 3.0 is going to be probably double what ESSER 2.0 was.
Over that. So we're looking at $2.3 to $2.6 billion for ESSER.
Wow. So as far as the GEAR 2.0, the $100 million, $72 million was going to non-public schools. How was that determined? How does each school district or each school maybe get their monies?
Sure. So we do a couple of things. We send out notices and a few notices to private schools. There's a deadline. They have to submit an intent to participate form because private schools can either participate in federal relief as a school or as a business. So some of our private schools did not submit intent to participate forms because they're going to participate in the Paycheck Recovery Program or some other federal program. You can only pick one. So we have the intent to participate forms, yes or no. Anyone we did not receive that form back from, we engaged and made sure we made contact to see whether they wanted to participate. Of kind of that group, we had private schools who decided yes or no, they actually were going to participate. And I believe it was 41% of those actually ended up saying they wanted to participate, covering, is it 39,000 students, just about 37,000 students. So then we decided to allocate money to the private schools in the same formula essentially that we use for public schools so that there would be some fairness across. Anything that is not used out of that $72 million that private schools do not ask for, they don't want to participate, that goes back to the discretionary funding for GEAR. The reasons that private schools have said that they did not want to participate were they don't want to take money from the federal government. They don't want to do the reporting. They don't believe it's enough money to make it worthwhile to do the reporting, or they are choosing to participate in a different relief program. Those are the top 4 reasons that we've heard in terms of why they wouldn't participate. But we are legally required to administer the program. That's in federal law.
So all these balances, I guess, left over from all these funds, how much is still left with ESSER 1.0? Because I know you're asking for 10.5 to be geared toward the literacy, PBS, advanced coursework. So what's the balance of ESSER 1.0?
So it varies pretty substantially by district as well as at the state level. Part of it was waiting to see what was going to happen in special session. Reading 360 just launched. We've been focusing on district supports over the state, frankly, with the capacity we have. So with 1.0, we've seen everything from 3.5% to 10% of the spending drawn down and all the way up to 100%. It depends on the district and how much money they got. Districts who got a lot more of an allocation, they take longer. I do want to just emphasize, and I appreciate you asking this question, when districts got the 1.0 in June, no one assumed or expected a 2.0. So what they were spending money on was allocated over a 12-month period. So you would expect that at this point in the year, they've only drawn down maybe 60% of the funding because they were trying to make it over time. With this 2.0, remember the plans aren't even until March 15th. Nothing's been spent down because essentially the plans are still being developed. So again, they're going to have about 2.5 years to spend 2.0, which is the 990 million will go to districts. And then on March 15th, we are very, very likely to get that additional 2.3 to 2.6 billion. 90% goes to districts. They have the same cut date on that. So they'll have essentially 12 weeks for planning purposes, and then they will have to spend all of that money by September 30th of 2023. That deadline did not change so far. It hasn't passed yet, but in the current iteration of the federal law, it is still September of 23.
So with ESSER 1.0, the 260 million roughly.
Mhm.
So what was that? How was that broken down? How much did the state get to keep of that versus, and just straight up, how much? What was the breakdown?
10% is the state set aside. 0.5% of that is the SEA. So we are 0.5% of the total to administer the grant. 9.5% is SEA discretionary grants. And then the 90% goes directly to LEAs.
Okay. And then my final question, Chair Lady, it's my final one. And it's like the elephant in the room here. Well, where is the accountability with this kind of money? Is this going to come from the federal level? Is it going to come from the state? Who's going to be giving the oversight to all this money? Because there's a whole lot of it and a whole lot more coming. So that's very, very concerning.
So my candid answer is the only accountability that is written into federal law is whether or not the money is spent in compliance with the law. There is no provision in federal law that allows for anybody in any level to dictate what happens at the local level. That's state government, the SEA, anybody. So it is complete discretion at the local level, as long as it is a reasonable justification for it being COVID related. And that is a pretty wide swath. The only exception to that is right now in ESSER 3.0, so the to be funded in 2 or 3 weeks, $2.6 billion, is there is a mandatory set aside in the House version that says the SEA must spend half of the SEA set aside on tutoring extended learning opportunities, and districts must spend at least 20% of their funding on tutoring and additional activities at the student level. So those are student academic services. Those are the only requirements in the law. So the accountability, our responsibility is to report on compliance only. We have no other kind of jurisdiction, and frankly, nobody does outside of the LEA.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chair Lady.
Representative Miller.
Commissioner, thank you.
Yes, sir. Mhm.
And he said that we were ranked at 47. Didn't disagree with that. And I'm thinking, number one, how do we actually define full funding related to the fall? After you pass the government budget and once we receive billions of dollars from the federal government, only Congress and the president signs off. Do you think our rankings from 47 will change? And if you think, based on all of that, it will change, when do you think it will change? And who makes these rankings?
So a number of good questions there. So forgive me if I don't respond to all of them, and please let me know. So from a ranking perspective, just to clarify, I do want to acknowledge that there are dozens, there's probably 20 that I see on a regular basis, ways in which we rank the states and how much they put into public education. I think there are a number that have Tennessee in the 40s. There are some that have us in the low 30s. It ranges depending on what they use to calculate. And that's everything from EdWeek to national teachers organizations, et cetera. So in that, yes, I would agree that typically that is where Tennessee falls. It does not change 1.4 billion additional dollars that have been put into public education over the last 10 years. So I want to acknowledge that. Now, in terms of this federal funding, that will have no impact on our ranking. The funding is given based on state shares. So Tennessee gets about a little over 2% of the total pot based on the population of students we have, and that's driven by income level. So we get about 2% of the funding, and so this would not be what the state invests in education, and that's where those rankings come from, so the BEP formula. So our ranking likely won't change as a result of federal funding. Those are all state level funding mechanisms, and that's where the rankings come from. in terms of, I think you had a question on fully funding and how we define that. And that's where it gets tricky. So I think fully funding the BEP means, does the state fund the formula as it is set out in the Blue Book? We run a formula, we put in the inputs to the formula. What the formula generates is what districts get. When you hear conversations about not fully funding, it is typically talking about when local districts put additional funding aside on top of the BEP. Those decisions are made at the local level. So when you hear about the additional funding that District A may put on top of the BEP or another district may, that's typically what you're talking about. But the formula itself is driven by statute, and so we fully fund that formula. I'm not sure if that answers your question, sir. Yes, sir.
Commissioner, we have some other questions, but in light of the fact that we do have time constraints and we have the whole budget to go through, I'm going to ask that those folks who have questions will keep your name here, and Commissioner's not going anywhere for a while. So we'll be able to ask her questions both about this expansion budget and the other budget. Having said that, I have one question of my own.
Yes, ma'am.
I saw on some of the materials provided that there are no extra positions associated with this expansion request, but then I'm hearing that maybe there are some extra positions. So can you just clarify that for us?
Yes, ma'am. So we, the Department of Education did not ask for additional positions in the governor's budget. So there are two options that the Congress, essentially in federal government, is recommending states do: either having temporary FTEs that would be added to the department, so adding actual full-time employees that would help to do monitoring, accountability, and reporting as required by federal law, or you can contract out those services. So you would hire contractors who would then go and do the same work on reporting, monitoring, accountability purposes for the funds. There's no scenario where you don't do one of those, because that is required in federal law, and that is part of what that 0.5% set aside that is just for the Department of Education. It is to account for those activities required by the federal law. So those are the two things you're likely hearing about under ESSER 1.0, under the $260 million. I can't believe I'm saying this, but it didn't feel like we needed more support for that. Like we can handle that with an additional 1.1 billion and potentially, very likely, another 2.3 to 2.6 billion. That is in total close to, it's just over with everything, $4 billion that we now have to be responsible for. We have 386 people who work at the central office. We've got essentially one person who does this kind of monitoring and reporting. And so we would be potentially asking for either the ability to have a short-term set of a short-term set of employees to support this reporting, just like we had in Race to the Top. It is my preference that we would have employees as opposed to contractors, because there is a lot more oversight we can have on their work. It is also, I think, more appropriate given what we would be asking for from districts.
And those employees would be for the life of the funding.
For the life of the funding. So they would be termed. We would not ask for a permanent expansion.
All right, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
You now, and first of all, let me apologize. I had a bill in another committee, so I wasn't here to welcome you. So I'll do that belatedly. I'm sure that Chairman Baum did that very articulately.
Yes, ma'am.
But we're going to ask you, if you would now, to just proceed going through the departmental budget without the expansion dollars. And then at the end, as I said, we can have questions related to both. So
Wonderful.
thank you.
So these, very briefly, and I know that this was something that was requested, but in terms of the work over the pandemic, and I know we've talked about this, but crisis management, resources, supports, you were seeing this across the country. It has been a very tough year in education. I think you were hearing that from your districts. They are working hard and they are tired. And so when we think about this budget, it is both trying to account for additional supports and resources, as well as how we can provide additional technical assistance. There are some examples on this slide. In terms of a recap from fiscal year 21, what you see is in March, obviously the full BEP formula was funded, that hold harmless. The temporary for just a couple of months was held harmless. You also see in April of 2020, we had a number of things from the Coronavirus Relief Fund. So that's a completely set of federal relief dollars, $77 million for disinfecting kits, PPE, et cetera, for schools, $50 million for technology, $15 million for access to high-speed internet, and then $11 million for reopening grants. That's all on top of the almost $260 million that we heard about before. In the summer of 2020, you saw that those federal 1.0 grants were awarded. You see the allocation here that Chairman Hicks had discussed. December of 2020 is when 2.0 passed. You see the numbers there. And then in January of 2021, you see the special session on education and what those funds are. That's the almost $117 million for learning loss, $1 million that we talked about previously for literacy, and then $42.9 million for teacher pay. In terms of what we are looking at moving forward in the department budget overview, you can see an allocation of the department budget overview, significant funds obviously for the BEP, and then you see a slight amount for the state special schools, just about $44 million, administration fees, and then federally funded and supported LEA programs at almost $1.3 billion, excuse me. In terms of the fiscal year 21 supplemental budget, want to be able to just provide a little bit more detail and context there. You see that almost $43 million for teacher pay. Those are one-time funds. Again, we covered both the state and the local share. That was part of what was in the what you all passed. So that is providing those increases ideally and directed towards educators. That goes back and is backdated to January 1st through June 30th. The summer learning supports is the almost $117 million that you see, and that's to provide funding for the learning loss camps, the bridge camps, the stream programming, and you see that that is $67.3 million in state funds, the $13.7 in the LEAPS reserve funds, and then $35.7 million coming out of the TANF reserve funds, and that was all from the special session bills in the supplemental budget. In terms of proposed reductions, as you know, all agencies were asked for proposed reductions. What you will see here are a number of them. So first and foremost, we reduced assessment by $2 million. We discussed last year that we negotiated new contracts related to assessment that allowed us to cut funding and resources and assessment without making cuts to those services that would go to districts. So we are still getting the same level of service and the same amount of programming. We are just doing it for $2 million less, and that was working with the vendor to be able to reduce the total assessment costs. Career Ladder, I want to emphasize, is still funded, full funding for the program, but as you know, we have teachers who retire each year. So the reduction you see here is to account for the teachers who are no longer in the program. The full program is still funded. You would expect to see fewer and fewer teachers over time as more teachers retire. So it's just accounting for those teachers who are no longer in the program. Academic operations is a cut to the department. So we, again, have been working very hard not to have cuts that would be felt by districts. So we did not cut district programs, but we did cut staff vacancies internally. So the $728,000 you see here is reduced capacity at the department level for academic operations. And that covers our academic shop as well as our human capital shop. So those are essentially reduction in vacancies that we will no longer fill and supports and resources that are at the department level, again, to prevent cuts to districts. We cut $30,000 in federal programs. So you can see we were looking at everything from the brand of pens to how many floors we have at the department, anything so that it doesn't hit districts, and then $6,400 cuts to the Achievement School District. And that again was more at the administration level. Total cuts is just over $8 million. In terms of requests for fiscal year 22, you see the expected growth, BEP ADM growth, and that's at 70.6. That's recurring. Insurance is covered with that at 11.6 recurring. And then state special schools, that's additional professional development and support for our state special schools at $156,000, which is recurring. Continuation of the special session work. So you see that the summer learning programs, there's $124.7 million that is non-recurring to support the summer learning programs, I think to the question earlier. And then literacy, we talked about the $1 million recurring to support all the new literacy initiatives. And then in terms of continuation projects, we are in year 3 each of the Future Workforce Initiative, the Literacy Coaching Pilot, and then the Rural Principal Development at 2.5, 1.8 million, and 500,000 respectively. And those are all non-recurring in their third year. In terms of the continuation, you saw in the governor's proposed budget a $120 million recurring investment in that instructional component of the BEP directed towards teacher salaries. That is the expectation and intent of those funds. You also see a one-time and a recurring investment proposal of $12 million for charter school facilities. If legislatively passed, there's that $20 million for BEP hold harmless. Again, to an earlier question, that is set aside in the governor's proposed budget. It does require a legislative component to be able for us to use the funding. So just because the money's there, it doesn't give the authority for us to actually spend or use the money. But it is set aside in case a hold harmless bill should pass during this session. And then 2.5 million in recurring accountability supports. That's to support portfolios that would be ongoing, as well as alternative to portfolios so that districts get additional support in that space. The total here is $380 million. Obviously, a significant portion of that is going for teacher salaries and then the summer learning programs and the one time that we talked about. Of the reductions as possible. So in fiscal year 20, 1,497 positions. To be clear, because I think there's oftentimes some confusion here, those are not people who are working across the street in the building. We've got 386. This includes the Achievement School District, our state special schools, the State Board of Education, the Charter Commission, et cetera. So we've reduced that from 1,497 to 1,176 for this year. So made those reductions. And then for next year in fiscal year 22, you see we're about flat at 1,178. That includes some additional reductions in one arm, but there's some proposals to increase by a couple of staff members at the state board level. And so that's the request that you see in terms of the additional two. And I know they'll speak to you about that. In terms of federal funding changes, you see a number of things here. Lots of federal funds, as we have discussed, but you see the ESSER 1.0, the amount is $26 million. That's the SEA set aside. The flow through, that's what goes to districts, is $233.9. You also see for GEAR, the 63.6 that we discussed. And again, you see that breakdown all the way through 110.8. So just about 111 for the SEA set aside for 2.0, 997 just about going to our LEAs. And that's again, LEA discretion. And then you see GEAR 2.0 that expires in September of 23 at 27 million and the private school set aside at 72. Again, they will likely not use all of that funding and just under half of that is expected to go back into the GEAR discretionary pot. We also received some federal competitive grants. You see the Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grant. That's $20 million for networks to support literacy implementation at the district level. So we will be launching those. I'm very excited about those across the state. And we also got the Connected Literacy Rethink Grant of $20 million. That is to provide tutoring. So families will get to have tutoring for their students, 13,000 students across the state, predominantly low income, but across the entire state will be able to get access to free tutoring for their children, as well as a device and access to high-speed internet. So again, it's to support children who need additional literacy development. In terms of capital improvements and maintenance, you see that we have some site improvements that need to happen for Tennessee School of the Blind. I think pretty critical site improvements at $4 million. And then we also have the West Tennessee School for the Deaf, some compliance upgrades that are absolutely necessary at 1.5. You see additional maintenance projects. And again, these are for our state special schools. Given the populations that we serve, it is incredibly important that we invest in facilities. A lot of students in these buildings are very reliant on facilities being able to accommodate their specific needs. So in total, we're looking at just about $11.4 million for facilities changes and improvements for our state special schools. And then I'm happy to answer questions on this or anything else that you might have at the discretion of our chair lady. So thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you, Commissioner, and we do appreciate, I know you went through a lot of money very quickly, and we appreciate the brevity, so we'll have time for more questions. Chairman Wendell, you are a carryover from before, so if you'd like to ask your question, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I just got one question for the Commissioner.
Yes, sir.
What percentage of Tennessee public school children are on free or reduced lunch?
Trying to think of what because it's varied since we have the community eligibility provision, but it's just I'll have Sam answer that specifically.
Yes, sir. We have 30.8% of our students last year were deemed economically disadvantaged. I do just want to differentiate that is a more severe threshold that they've hit in terms of their income and poverty rates than free and reduced price lunch. Because of the community eligibility provision that the commissioner mentioned, there's a way districts are able to provide free meals for students if they have an economically disadvantaged rate above 40%.
So what's your definition of a more severe definition? Is it harder to qualify for free and reduced lunch or easier to qualify?
It's
You puzzled me
actually-
by severe.
I apologize. Yes, sir. So the economically disadvantaged rate that is used now is based on participation in programs like SNAP and TANF and students who are in foster care, homeless, runaway, or migrant status.
Okay, just one follow-up. So only 1 out of 3 public school children in Tennessee are eligible for a free or reduced lunch.
So this is the differentiation point, and I apologize if I don't get this quite right for you. Happy to follow up offline as well. The new definition of economically disadvantaged is used in BEP and accountability, and it's those categories I just mentioned. Schools can actually still serve free and reduced price lunch to students above and beyond that based on the rate of those economically disadvantaged students in their schools. So more students can benefit based on the rate of that.
We'll talk off. I appreciate the attempt to answer it. I'm still confused, but I'll talk to you offline. But thank you very much, man. That's helpful. We'll talk later. Thank you.
Chairman Williams.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, Commissioner.
Of course.
I was getting a primer there from Peter. I noticed in the budget you had $20 million set aside for hold harmless. This is based upon the number of children in seats across the state, this in the rolling 3-year average. So you stated in your comments that we needed legislative approval to be able to utilize these funds. Is the governor preparing, or has he prepared an administration bill in order to allow us to distribute these funds? And at what point in time, of course, it may be a while before we know what those numbers actually look like for the following year. So I wondered what the timeline looked like for that, or whether we would have to pass a bill prior to us even knowing that data and the rolling 3-year average.
So I will answer the first part of that, and then I will have Charlie answer in terms of potential caption bills and things that might cover this. So what the hold harmless would do, should there be, and there's lots of different ways this can be calculated and run, and that's what we would be obviously very deferential to the General Assembly in terms of if you wanted to move forward on something. But in this space, what we would do is say what districts would have received last year. So had there not been a pandemic, what would we project that amount to be? That is essentially what the argument would be to fund, because there isn't a way to know who left the system and is coming back, who left the system and is not coming back. And so this would essentially be a hold harmless. So you would get what districts would have received last year. You essentially replicate that, and that's for the averages, et cetera. I'll defer to Charlie in terms of intent for any kind of administration bill or caption.
Thanks, Chairman Williams. Thank you, Madam Chair. The administration does have a caption bill relative to BEP funding that could be used should it be the will of the legislature to pursue that. I know there's been a lot of ongoing conversations with leadership dating back to special session. I know there are additional bills that some of your colleagues have that they've filed, but that bill number that the administration has is House Bill 777.
What a great number. Anyways, just as a follow-up to your budget presentation, I know, first of all, in the back of the room is one of our PBS affiliates, WCTE. Data casting is a huge component of what we do in education. The value of that during COVID and the pandemic was dramatic. And so I met with them today. I know that you already have partnership. I saw where you have accommodated for some continued partnership in this year's budget with them. I do think as we talk about rural broadband and students' access to data, I think it's really important if we consider all the alternatives. I met with them today. They said one of the ways to do that is through the same data casting PBS signal is to distribute Google Classroom or live data as it relates to their classrooms in their homes using their broadcast signal. And when we have limited numbers of kids and the uptake rate of broadband, I think it's really important. So I want to say thank you for that partnership, and I look forward to continuing the discussion as it relates to how they can continue to partnership with you.
Yes, sir. I appreciate that. And if I might, Madam Chair, I do want to just acknowledge, because I know Becky with her crew, and I have had the privilege of working with a number of PBS stations in different roles, but it has been a total privilege to work with PBS stations. And I cannot underscore enough the role that they have played for students. It has been transformational for a number of our students across the state, and I am very, very pleased that we're able to put this money aside and continue to work with them. So I appreciate you acknowledging them personally. It's been a real privilege for me. Yes, sir.
Chairman Hicks.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Commissioner.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned the 70.6 million recurring for the BEP formula for ADM growth and inflation. Of course, the 5.2 billion total budget, and then last year it was nearly 4.9 billion. In recent years, the department has reverted 25 to 50 million each year, and then mostly again from this BEP funding. What's the concerns this year? Can you talk a little bit about enrollment for some districts, how that's going to affect the need for growth funding?
So I will talk about that, and then I will defer also to talk a little bit about that change in BEP. So what we are seeing across the state is the same trends that we are seeing nationally, and it's going to impact different districts differently. We are seeing a pretty significant in what we saw in kindergarten enrollment, for example. A lot of folks are keeping their kids, they're calling them red shirt kinders, and I was like, anything we can do to connect it to football. So we're doing red shirt kinders this year. They'll go into kindergarten next year. So we are expecting a larger kindergarten class next year than we've had maybe this year or in prior years. So that's something that is going to be a big factor. We're also seeing a lot of reduced engagement at the high school level. And that's something that we've seen kind of on those bookends, some high school students who are looking to go to work. We are concerned about things like graduation rates and dropout as a result of that. In terms of the impact, I think that is why you are hearing from districts, if you are so directly, that they want to make sure that anything that they would have had that they can't account for as a result of a pandemic at home, they're looking at alternative models for education based on what the parent choices in that home, that districts then have this financial impact that might only be for this year. We can't project into the future. And so what they're asking for is a hold harmless to be able to say, look, we expect most of these students to come back. Can we fund that for a year to make sure that we can budget appropriately? Now, certainly we have one-time federal funds. And again, there's some discussion in terms of all of that together, but this is that 3-year average that they are looking for and relying on. So that's some of the conversation you'll hear, but I'll turn it to Sam if there's anything you want to add or certainly true. He said it was fine, so a little feedback from a team.
Let me ask you this question, and maybe you can answer it, or maybe Sam wants to. As far as the expected reversion that you're expecting for the 2021 school year, what will that look like?
Do you want to?
So for the 21 school year, for 21, I'll defer to Drew on that to see what the difference is and what the formula generated versus the budget piece.
I apologize. We'll have to pull that number and get it to you right after this. I will say for FY20.
If you could just state your name for the record,
My
please.
apologies. Drew Harper, Assistant Commissioner of Finance. In FY20, that number was 11 million that we reverted from the BEP in particular, which ends up being about a 0.23% reversion on the BEP. So we're tightening up very, very much about where our estimates are versus what we're actually reverting. We also saw in the FY20 to FY21 about a 0.8% growth, which was much higher than we had in the year before. The final point there is when we're budgeting for FY21, we're also trying to keep that step forward, fully anticipating that the majority of these students are coming back, that this is a red shirt kinder type world. So maintaining this increase in BEP for regular increases in ADM is just a way to make sure that we're smoothing the budget over the different years.
Okay. Thank you.
Chairman Todd.
Thank you, Chairman. I know the department received around $50 million in coronavirus relief funds for district technology grants. It reported, I think y'all reported about 148,000 students, or 17% of students statewide, did not have internet connectivity at home in the fall of 2020. Do you have data now on how many students did not have access to technology, including laptops, et cetera, in addition to the connectivity issues?
That's a great question. I do not have that information on me. I think we can absolutely get that specific data back to you. We can certainly talk about additional programs. I do want to acknowledge T-Mobile has given us a grant that will allow us to provide high-speed internet for, I think it's 200,000 folks over the course of 5 years, but I'll defer to Sam to see if you have any additional info on that.
The only additional comment I would note there is that we are about to launch our district technology survey, and we've added a number of questions on that to help really field these questions and learn more about what the landscape looks like outside of the school.
One more. Do you think this will also assess whether the teachers have had the same challenges?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
We'll get you the information on that as soon as it comes in.
Representative Sexton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is on the ADM, the enrollment levels. What is anticipated in the future?
I think that, so when I will say in talking with districts, and I will also ask Sam and Drew to chime in for anything that I missed, that we are seeing different growth in different districts. We have some very, very high growth districts. I am expecting that as a state, we will continue to see enrollment increases year over year. That has been the trend. And that is what we are funding in terms of growth. That's going to look different in different parts of the state. But Sam, I don't know if you have anything, or Drew, anything to add on top of that. We do expect our student enrollment as a state to continue to grow based on what we're seeing with our younger grades.
So on these long-term plans, how do you see them trending, and what's your plans for those?
I'm sorry, for which program, sir?
As far as the long-term trends,
Mhm.
what are you planning for? What are your plans?
So, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that we are certainly thinking about, and we are frankly talking with districts and encouraging districts to think about, especially with one-time funds. So the biggest challenge I see right now is really around facilities. As we're seeing the growth, you always hit that spot where you have too many students for one building, but not enough to necessarily open up a new school. So that foresight and planning, especially if you look at areas like Clarksville, Montgomery, has been growing quite a bit in terms of student enrollment. You have other areas that have been relatively flat. So we want to see some building and some planning related to school facilities. Very concerned about that from a district perspective. We are looking to potentially add some facilities capacity support to our district operations team to address that. I think the other thing that we're looking at that I spoke to was on educators and the supply there. So if we are looking at a third of our educators, so 20 to 25,000 folks who are retirement eligible right now, and that they would potentially be retiring over the next, let's say, 3 to 7 years, and we don't have enough people to replace them in the pipeline right now, that ends up being a very significant and very urgent situation for students and for the state. So in terms of what we are thinking about from a growth and student growth perspective, it is making sure every single child in the state has a high quality Tennessee teacher in front of them for those content areas, and that child has a safe place in which to learn. So when we're looking at growth, those are the two biggest needs that I see that we are looking to address with these one-time funds.
Madam Chair, one more question, please. Thank you for that answer. My district is in very rural, and I was just wondering if you have any statistics that show a percentage of normally the rural areas are losing some and or the metro areas are gaining. Do you have any feel for percentage of those type movements? And when was the last time that you actually did a study?
Yes, sir. So what we have is we have what enrollment looks like, and we take those different enrollment throughout the year. So we also know what kind of it was at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. We can look at student IDs and see where students are moving to and from. I wouldn't be able to speak to that at kind of the granular level of a specific district, but would be happy to get back to you with some examples of, especially in rural to more of our urban or suburban areas, what that looks like.
So you don't have a statewide of rural versus metro or anything like that?
We have each district's enrollment, and we can look at those trends over time, but not necessarily where students have moved to and from.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, sir.
But Commissioner, I believe you could look at rural districts and average the loss or gain or
ma'am.
whatever in metro districts and give us those kinds of numbers. I think that's one of the things that Representative Sexton would be interested in.
We'd be happy to, and we'll get you those numbers, sir.
Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, thank you for being here. What are the plans for transferring operation of schools in the Achievement School District?
So there is currently a piece of legislation around that exit. So for context, the ASD, it is intended to be schools would be there for the 10 years. And at the end of 10 years, there's a transition. We've hit that point. We're coming up on that point, but there wasn't ever any kind of policy made in terms of what the transition looks like. So there is a bill to account for that. Within that, very generically speaking, it would be that the local LEA or the LEA would be able to determine, since most of them are charter schools, would be able to determine whether they would be the permanent authorizer. If not, then on appeal, it would go to the charter commission. So that's currently the path for charter schools in the state. But it is really looking at putting into place some policies in terms of what that exit procedure looks like, since there hasn't been anything established to date.
Representative Lynn.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Can you talk to us about well, first, I really feel compelled to say, as a grandmother of children in younger grades, I couldn't be more disappointed with their education over this COVID period. And talking to other parents in my district of all ages, everybody has been disappointed. And it seems every single time we turn around, schools are closing again. And it is so frustrating. Parents just feel like their children haven't learned anything at all. So with that said, my question is the recent assessment scores and graduation rates and average ACT scores, how are they? But we know that's a lagging indicator.
Yes, ma'am.
That is not covering COVID at all. So how are they? How did they come in? And what do we expect? I mean, we even hear the school district asking us not to give a standardized test. We, with the state of Tennessee, the taxpayers of the state of Tennessee, provide billions of dollars to the local schools. We have a responsibility to ask for accountability on how students are doing. And the only way we can do that is look at a test score. So it's just unbelievable to me that they don't want the children tested. Another thing I don't understand is everybody in this room had standardized tests. I remember showing up at school, walk in the classroom, put your books under your desk, take out a number 2 pencil. Oh, we're having standardized tests today. We didn't have weeks and weeks and weeks of nerve-wracking pressure. And so I don't understand why this happens today. Why is there weeks and weeks and weeks of nerve-wracking pressure on teachers, on students, on everybody, when, I mean, back in the day, literally, we just walked in the classroom and they said, put your stuff away, pull out a number 2 pencil, and that was it. And we had no idea when the standardized test was going to be. And, we all took it, and those grades were part of, statistics, and I suppose people used it to determine how to improve on teaching us. But it didn't give me a bellyache or anybody else that I knew. We just came in and took the standardized test. And, we were very happy for our education and very grateful for our education. Absolutely. So can you talk to us about, how were we doing? And what do we expect to see on these assessment tests, these graduation rates, these ACT test scores coming up in the future? Because, to me, this whole last year, it's lost. It is lost. And these poor children, I mean, I don't know, maybe there's some place where parents are really happy and they feel like their kids got a good education for the past year, but not in my district. I hear it all the time. And I grieve it because there's only so many days that we have those little ones in school and we can teach them. There's only so many days. They're not infinite. And, a whole year is lost. So.
Yes, ma'am. So a number of questions there. I'm going to try to just kind of paint a picture in terms of where I am and where I think we will be and where certainly we are going. So in terms of the data for the state right now, what we are seeing in the youngest grades for English language arts is that we've been essentially, whether we call it, I've heard the word stable, consistent, flat, whatever you want to call it, we've essentially maintained the same proficiency or meeting of grade level expectations. If we're looking at 3rd and 4th grade, we've seen some decline in 8th grade, and then high school has varied. For math, we have seen some increases. And so I think we're seeing something different in ELA and math. ACT has remained predominantly stable, a very tiny dip we saw last year. Certainly COVID has played into that because we had students who normally would take it in the spring, took the test in the fall, and so our reporting's a little bit off from what it traditionally has. We've seen consistent growth in graduation rates over time, but this brings me to where we are this year. And here's the hard conversation is none of us have been through a pandemic. And I think you know, and I think many of you have been with me on some school visits, but been to almost 50 districts this year in terms of seeing what education looks like for students in classrooms. And I will say that whatever the format is, folks are really tired. Those are teachers, those are principals, superintendents, parents. And I have little kids in school. I am also in schools visiting. I have a husband who works in education, and my sisters and cousins are all in education. So it is very difficult to assess what should have been, could have been, would have been for this year. And I think it is also something where when I'm talking with superintendents or teachers or families, everybody's stressed and everybody is tired, and we are all thinking about what could have been this year had a pandemic not happened. But a pandemic did. And I think what I am very encouraged by, and frankly, the optimism that I feel, are things like a General Assembly who came together and invested significant money, millions of dollars, in ensuring that students have opportunities this summer. No other state has done that. No other state has done that. I am encouraged by a window opening for early literacy training and seeing that within 2 hours, over 65 districts have already signed up to ensure that their teachers get additional support in early literacy. I would not have expected that with how tired folks are. So this ongoing commitment that we all share to supporting children, I think is absolutely in place. We will likely see dips this year in standardized testing. That will likely happen. And that is expected across the entire country. What is going to make our state different, and I deeply believe this with every fiber of my being, I believe this, is that the attitude and the mindset of folks in the field right now who are tired, and I'm going to be honest, a little grumpy like all of us are, the fact that they are still signing up within the first couple of minutes to get more professional development, help their kids more, do summer programming, tells me that when we look back in 5 years, Tennessee will be significantly better off than any other state in this country. I deeply believe that is true because of the people who work in the field, because of the investments you all are making. And then frankly, because our mindset is we are going to be number one in this country. One way or another, we are going to get there. And it is because of hard work, a deep mindset, and frankly, I think acceptance that this has been a very, very difficult year, but we will be better for it on the other side. More tired, for sure, but I think we will be better for it. And our test scores are going to show that. And I think we will also start to hear that and feel that more from communities and teachers.
So far as the online programs go that the children do to do their classwork.
Yes, ma'am.
Is there sort of a standardized format for that? Because I have done that with that online module, whatever. And I found it's not very intuitive. You have to flip between pages to get to what you need. Things were difficult. I mean, it really was not laid out well at all. It was really rather frustrating to do. And I felt bad for the little ones because they don't even know how to use a computer really. So, just trying to figure it out and get them on their lesson in time and all of that, it was very hard. Is there some sort of minimum requirements for these online learning classrooms or whatever? And is there also some sort of intuitive measures that these portals should have? Because, like I said, they don't seem very friendly to use, especially if, you've never used it before.
Yeah, so I think and that's a great question in terms of, I think what we saw, especially this year, and all districts had a continuous learning plan. So that was a plan that they had to submit for approval about what online learning would look like, or remote learning would look like during the pandemic if they had to shut down a school or for any certain reason, or the school building. And I think as a result of that, what we saw nationally is that as a country, education was not set up to move immediately from in-person to online. So folks were setting up whatever was available in the best way they could. And I think what I've at least seen is that what we saw in the spring, where some districts could and some districts frankly couldn't because there weren't even computers or iPads at that point. What I saw in the fall was a significantly more well thought out structure because there was time to plan. As the school year progressed, I've seen it getting stronger and stronger. The field has responded to, I think, as more technology is coming, they can make it more developmentally appropriate, which I think is what you're speaking to for younger students in particular. I think we will continue to see that to evolve and improve over time. It certainly doesn't speak to whether or not everyone was ready to on a dime shift to online learning. That absolutely was not true. And I don't think anyone expected that that was going to be true. But I think what we are seeing is that people are getting stronger and stronger. Our educators are facilitating between all sorts of different mechanisms and modes, in person and online at the same time, one after the other. We're seeing the same thing with families, kind of all trying to be flexible in this space. I do think the benefit is that if we're going into the future, we will have significantly better programs and opportunities for online learning in the future, should it be necessary.
Just one last thing, Madam Chairman.
We need to really wrap it up. Representative Lynn, we have another question and we have another presenter. So quickly.
Just one short thing. What I found most shocking was literally these programs had typographical errors, punctuation errors, even incorrect grammar. And I felt like that was shocking. And this is supposed to be school. So I just wanted to add that comment. I don't know who screens these things, but those things were surprising to me.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. We appreciate the fact that you have gone through a lot of information very quickly and answered questions. I would say to our members, as you have a chance to look more in depth at this presentation, this budget, if you have additional questions, obviously you're welcome to reach out to the Commissioner or staff, but it would really be helpful, I think, to the committee as a whole. If you have a question, someone else might benefit from that answer. So if you want to send them through our office and we'll get responses and share with everyone. And I do want to say to the question about the technology, my grandchildren have done both, in classroom and virtual learning at different times during this past year. And I think education, just like every other field, has been impacted obviously by COVID, and there's some things that have been learned, some things that could probably be done well virtually. Teaching kindergartners is probably not one of them, but I do think that there'll be lessons that we can learn from this and carry forward, and I think there'll be opportunities for us to do things with AP classes online and things of that nature for our older students that could really prove to benefit particularly the rural areas of the state in years to come. So again, thank you. And to all the educators in Tennessee who have, just fought through some very challenging times. And as you said, some are grumpy, but then so are some of us, and not without reason, perhaps.
That's right.
I'll put a smile on our face and get through this and go forward. So again, thank you. And we appreciate the work that you do for the state, and because our children, they are our greatest resource. So
yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
We are going to have just a minute for our folks to clean the mics, and then we have our final presentation of the day from the State Board of Education.
Good. Johnny on the spot, weren't we? It's fixed. Yeah. Let's see. What's the button I hit to make this thing go?
Make it what?
Make it in presentation.
Go up to slideshow.
Yeah.
And then from beginning.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, why don't you come over?
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us fairly late in the day. We just ask that our presenters introduce yourselves for the record. This is the Tennessee State Board of Education. So, Dr. Morrison, I believe you're going to lead off.
Yes, thank you. Sarah Morrison, Executive Director at the Tennessee State Board of Education. Thank you for having us today. We're thrilled to be here to talk to you a little bit about the work of the State Board and specifically our budget requests this year. With me, I have Nathan James, our Director of Legislative Affairs and External Relations, and Angie Sanders, our General Counsel. Just very briefly, as the chairman mentioned, the State Board is the governing and policy-making body for Tennessee education. So we just heard in this committee from the Commissioner of Education and their important work as sort of the implementing body in K-12 education, a much bigger agency than the State Board, but we really are kind of the policy-making body. Our work touches a lot of different facets of education in Tennessee, from things like licensure for teachers, which we'll talk about, to accountability, to testing, to teacher evaluations, you name it, and we probably have policy and rules about it.
Our membership consists of one member from each congressional district. They are appointed by the governor, and they
If
go
you
through-
would, your name.
Nathan James, State Board of Education. Sorry
Thank
about that. One member appointed from each congressional district. They're appointed by the governor to 5-year terms, and they are confirmed by votes of both houses of the General Assembly. We also have a student member, and our ex officio member is the executive director of the Higher Education Commission, Dr. House. Yeah, these are our current members, and we're pleased to have Mr. Garrett Hamby as our student member this year.
Like all things related to the State Board, in statute, we have the requirement to have a master plan, which we take seriously every year. We're thinking about the policy work that the board needs to engage in. And just last July in 2020, we reset our 5-year student-focused goals that will remain in place until 2025. And then we'll be revisiting annually the policies that we think will drive us towards those goals as a state. Just very briefly, the point of seeing these goals up here is that we are thinking with a student focus at the State Board. We're thinking big and longer term in terms of what policies and systems need to be in place so that we can say with confidence that every student in Tennessee has the opportunity to have an excellent education that will allow them first, in our first goal, to be reading at grade level in grade 3. Second, to be graduating from middle school and going on to high school prepared for success in that period of their time with us in the K-12 system. And that furthermore, strategic goal number 3, that when they leave our system at the end of high school, that they're prepared for success after high school. The last 2 goals that we anchor ourselves in are ensuring human capital is strong, that we have an effective teacher in every classroom across the state. We do a lot at the board, both in terms of licensure and teacher training, but also in terms of licensure discipline. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, that students have access to high quality education in whatever form they need it. So that's both in terms of some of our choice options in the charter sector, opportunity scholarships, and also in the method of delivery. Of course, this last year, we've been thinking a lot about online learning and what's the board's responsibility to make sure that we've really thought about the systems and the policies that we need to transition to that online delivery of education in many cases. So now just briefly some specifics of the board's work before we talk about our budget request. I'll briefly mention our transitioning responsibilities with respect to charter schools. Since 2003, charter operators in the state have been able to appeal a denial of a charter school by the local district to the State Board. We were very much in support of the legislation that is kind of creating a transition in that work for the state board this year. It'll set up the Tennessee Charter School Commission, which will be a standalone body, independent from the department and from the state board, to hear those appeals in an ongoing way and allow them to focus on that work. We will be taking up some new work in the charter space, but it'll be a lighter touch, adhering to the high standards that we have for making those important decisions about what schools should open, what schools should close in the charter sector. We'll also talk about that related to our budget, because that does have a pretty dramatic effect on our net budget. The Tennessee Academic Standards, this is the foundation for much of what we do in the K-12 space. You have to have standards to help us know, what students should know and be able to do in any grade or subject. And then from there, we're able to think about, textbooks and materials, as well as in place for reviewing standards. Public Survey has various educator groups that review the public input and put their mark on our standards process. And then we have a standards recommendation committee, which is a core recommendation that comes to the board. This is for the 4 core academic areas, so English language arts, math, science, and social studies. Leader training, we produce a report card annually by statute that reports on the outcomes and various kind of key characteristics of the programs across our state that train teachers and leaders for the classrooms and the schools in Tennessee. We kind of revised this approach in 2016 to try to make it a much more user-friendly tool. So if you go to our website now, you'll see that depending on whether you're a district looking to hire teachers and wanting to know what institution is really producing educators who are effective in the classroom, to find data that helps inform your decisions.
So getting into a little bit of core functions of the State Board of Education, we get into rules and regulations, and specifically what happened with this last year. One of the things that the State Board of Education undertook was to make a series of emergency rules that were very necessary in terms of what would happen with the class of 2020. One of the actions that you all took before going on recess last year was to pass Public Chapter 6 of COVID-19, ensure that no LEA district employee or students were adversely impacted, and charge the board with answering the questions about what about that class of 2020. Since 2016, the State Board has taken on a comprehensive rule and policy audit to review every approved item, both for modernity and relevance. This resulted in the repeal of several arcane policies and improved alignment between current law, practice, and policy in other areas. We're pleased to announce that in 2020, we finished up some of the last of these transitions. Something we briefed the Government Operations Committee on with some frequency.
Board, when you think about all the 70,000 plus teachers and the principals that we employ across Tennessee, anytime, well, not anytime, but I should say many times have a legal team that's really in additional capacity, which we'll talk about in a minute, to be able to handle those licensure discipline issues as they come into our office. So there's a case management function, there's a litigating function, there's also the need to go back to districts oftentimes and request additional information, to work with other agencies like Department of Children's Services and others who are doing investigations of these educators, to make sure that we're really recommending to our board a fair and appropriate response in terms of a state licensure issue. And that's specifically so that you don't have an educator who is disciplined in one district, and this still does happen sometimes, and then it's not reported to the state, and it's something serious and involving the safety when needed on their license. So you can see there on the slides in terms of the budget requests that we really feel like is necessary to do that work. Budget and then had to be withdrawn when the pandemic hit. But we really think to make this work in our office, we need 3 additional attorneys and 2 paralegals to round out our ability to do the litigation, the case management, and all the other functions that are related to the discipline work. And then finally, as you look here on that same slide, in this year's budget, the executive budget proposes 2 new legal team positions, which would be a good start in that direction in terms of allowing us to have 1 additional attorney and 1 additional paralegal for that work, as well as some case management software, which will help just in terms of the logistics of this work.
One of the other functions of the State Board of Education is that we administer the BEP Review Committee. When the legislature decided on the BEP, they created this more metered approach to the report. It used to be that when the BEP report would come out, it was process. So what we did was switch to a process where, in addition to the report, we also create a list of priorities. And that priority list happens in July and the August timeframe so that it can be factored more favorably in by the administration as they create the executive budget. The number one priority this year was the whole funding harmless. Number two was continued compensation. Number three, increased funding for technology and accessibility. Number four, funding the number of school counselors at a level closer to the national best practices. Number five, funding the number of school nurses at a level closer to national best practices. And number six, increased funding to the Response, Intervention, and Instruction Committee. So, I'll say this, with that process, this General Assembly and previous General Assemblies have been absolute champions of education and have worked very, very closely, both with this administration and the previous administration, to make that successful. On the last few days, Public Chapter 792 was passed by the General Assembly, which created the Educational Recovery and Innovation Commission to take cognizance of the effect of COVID-19, but also, and other natural disasters which had happened last year, but also to potentially rethink the educational structure of Tennessee from K through career. The charge is to advise the General Assembly, the State Board of Education, the Department of Education, Tennessee Higher Education Commission, and the state institutions of higher education on strategies to close educational gaps related to these school closures and to modernize the educational structure. They did come out with a report that was sent to you on Christmas Eve last year. That commission consists of 9 members, 3 appointed by each speaker, 3 appointed by the governor, and cost the state nothing. There's no fiscal note attached to that.
Okay, thank you for bearing with us. But now our actual budget numbers, which are relatively uninteresting in terms of the scope, consistent in this year's budget, and that's due to the fact that we're losing 2 positions to the Charter Commission, and then we would be potentially gaining the 2 that are in the executive budget for our legal team. So that keeps us at 14 moving into the 21-22 budget year.
So if we look at the actual budget breakdown, I would refer you to the green sheets provided to you by your excellent staff at the House Budget Office. They show the and you'll see we're going from nearly $18 million down to about $2.1 million this year.
And that's largely due to the flow-through dollars for the schools that we oversee currently that are moving to the commission, those BEP dollars. So in terms of our request for this fiscal year, our top request was for a communications position. This is something that we've requested for 6 years in a row now, and unfortunately still haven't found a way to secure it, but we have thankfully been able to use grant dollars to fund a contractor in this role. I will say, particularly during the pandemic and the board's meeting as regularly as Nathan mentioned, almost monthly, starting in March of 2020, to take on the different regulations that were needed to close out last school year and think about the opening of this school year. That work is more critical than ever. That person is responsible for hosting all of our meetings virtually and all of the technology behind that. They're also responsible for helping our board members to do outreach with their constituents, to think about for the educator prep report card, how are you making sure that hits all of our audiences. There's just a number of things related to our work that requires outreach to stakeholders and an extremely under-resourced legal team. When you look at other states in this sort of same vein of licensure discipline work, Angie can tell us better, but we are at the bottom or very near the bottom in terms of the resources needed to do that work effectively. And so again, our request this year was for 3 additional attorneys and 2 paralegals to help support the really increasing volume. And again, Angie can talk through some of those statistics, but just compared to in 2018 to 2019, we saw a 74% increase in the volume of those cases coming into the board. So it's not something that's diminishing. If anything, as we begin hopefully to outreach to private and charter schools, which at this point in time, we haven't had the staff to adequately do that. Unfortunately, I think we're going to see those numbers continue to tick up. We were, as I mentioned, the 2 positions for the legal team and the money for the case management software included in the executive budget, which will definitely be a start in the direction that's needed in terms of funding the legal team at the level necessary to really do that work effectively. But I'll stop there. That's our request for this year, and happy to turn it back for any questions that you may have.
Thank you. And we do have some questions, beginning with Representative Garrett.
Included 180,000 recurring in 2 positions for additional teacher licensure staff and case management system. And I noticed as I was looking over your questionnaire that you requested just over $439,000 for staff attorneys and software management systems. So kind of two questions to follow up with that. So what would have been funded by your original request that is not included in the proposed increase? And then secondly, as a follow-up, will this proposed increase help address the caseload increase you have reported over the past few years? So if you could address a couple of those, I would appreciate that.
Sure.
Thank
And
you.
I will start, and again, I'll turn it over to our very capable general counsel over here. But your second question, yes, this really will help. The case management software is something that we've desperately needed to make sure that we're really accurately and consistently keeping tabs on all of these cases that get opened and then closed and then reopened if there's another infraction that occurs. And so that will certainly help in terms of the management of the cases. And then the 2 positions that we would potentially be gaining in this proposed budget would be 1 attorney and 1 paralegal. So certainly that would help our capacity. In terms of the full request, and we've had to do a lot of thinking about this over the last few years as we've seen these numbers tick up, and I've really challenged our legal team to put together what it would take to do this work, at maximum effect, without obviously more resources than we ultimately need. And so Angie, if you want to take just a minute to talk about the structure of the full request.
Sure. Angie Sanders. I'm the general counsel for the State Board of Education. So as Sarah mentioned, we were very happy to see the 2 positions in the budget, in the executive budget. However, in an ideal world where we could do this work at the level that we want to be able to do it, we would have essentially 5 new positions instead of 2. So we're about 3 short of what we would ideally want to be able to do this work. We would like to be able to split our legal team up into essentially 2 different teams. One team that would handle case intake. So they would intake any new reports, open those cases, request information, analyze that, bring it to our internal staff case review process, do all the prep related to that. Negotiate any consent orders with those educators, and then present those to the board. We would then like to have a separate team that handles any litigation of cases where educators either requesting. So after that case management or the case review committee makes a decision that they're going to recommend some action against an educator's license, we send them a notice. And if they request a hearing or if they fail to respond to that notice, we have to essentially institute a hearing on their behalf. That's a requirement of the Uniform Administrative Procedures Act. So in those 2 cases, those cases would get handed off to our litigation team, who would then litigate those cases before a administrative law judge, and therefore not have to be dealing with both the case intake and the litigation piece of it. Our attorneys have between 200 and 300 open cases at any point in time, and that's just a rolling basis. Right now, we have 2 attorneys and 1 paralegal. So you can imagine that's a very high caseload. It's hard to be managing everything that you need to do from start to finish, including hearings, when you have that many cases on your plate. So we think we could serve the citizens of the state of Tennessee on a much more efficient basis, because educators, obviously, this is a very stressful time for them when they've been reported to the state board and they know that there's a potential that there would be some sort of action against their license. And so we work as quickly as we possibly can to get those through our process. We have a case review, our internal case review meetings every single month. But we can only move as fast as our manpower lets us do that. So the funding for the full request, which would be 5 positions rather than just 2, would help us get there.
One last plea there, because it's really also hard to keep people in those positions because the turnover rate, given the dealing with, is very high.
Welcome.
Chairman Baum.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have heard how the Department of Education has literally received billions of dollars in COVID relief funding through the federal government's ESSER and GEAR programs. Has the State Board of Education received any of these funds funds?
I appreciate the question. The answer is no. But we have been working closely with our partners at the department around their responsibility to administer and see that fund, multiple funds, both the state portion and the local portion used effectively. So in terms of the conversations and what we'd like to see as a state, we're part of that process, but will not receive those funds directly.
All right, thank you.
Leader Lamberth.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just a quick operational follow-up. Is the Charter School Commission fully separate from the state board now, and were there any issues with that transition? I've kind of answered with the second part of that, the first part of my question, but talk to me about the transition and were there any issues there?
Great. Yes. And I don't know that you've heard from the commission yet in terms of their budget hearing, but no, it's been very smooth. And in part, the commission, they are a standalone body, completely separate, like the state board in terms of independent in nature, not affiliated with either the Department of Education or the State Board of Education. But they hired our former executive director of our charter schools, Tess Stovall. So that's ensured a really seamless transition. She was the one who really built the appeals process at the state board, has been handling that work and knows it inside and out. She's got great relationships with the operators and the districts in our state, the authorizers. So it's about as seamless as you could hope for. And in terms of the timeline of transition, the appellate duties switched over to the commission as of January 1 of this year. And the schools that the state board has authorized and currently oversees will transition to the commission after July 1 of this year. So we're sort of in the middle of the transition, but so far so good.
Chairman Hawk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And shift a bit from dollars to policy. We get calls all the time about civics and government required in school. And to change gears a little bit, what I've looked up, and I know what they are, but just for the record, I know there are 3 social study requirements to graduate high school, and civics and government, U.S. history are part of that. If y'all can tell us a little bit about that so we can tell our constituents back home.
Absolutely. And I may look to Nathan because he has this chapter and verse, but
He's going to look it up on his phone as well.
That's right, yeah. We'll be ready.
because they're all related to most of, I think what you're indicating is related to
Exactly.
statutory changes.
And I know that we have worked in this space, and former leader McCormick worked in this space several years ago when he was still serving. And I know that there are requirements, and just to assure our constituency that there are government requirements, if you could state those for us. Thank you.
And I may not be able to call out the precise courses. I can tell you that, earlier in this process, we were talking about the standards review process that you all set up in 2016. And I say you all because it was the General Assembly that made that happen. When it came time to do the social studies review, we pulled every single portion of Title 49 out that related to civics, related to government, related to original sources from the Constitution, the Tennessee Constitution. Every single piece that you all and the General Assembly had put in to Title 49, every one of them was addressed in those standards in mandatory courses for the most part. And so there's not more in law about science, not really more in law about reading even. Social studies is where there's a ton of input, and every bit that you all put in there was faithfully placed in those standards.
And just one more point on that. There's 3 courses that are required in Tennessee. World history, U.S. history, and government and civics. And then as part of the government and civics, there is a civics project that's specifically called for in statute too. So hopefully that gives you, and we can certainly follow up in writing if that's helpful.
World history, U.S. history, government, and civics. There we go. We got the team. They can't all be in the room, but they're
Good test though.
That's right.
I have a question related to the educator report card. I don't think there's any more critical to a student getting a good education. That's not going to happen without a good teacher in the classroom. And I know some of our institutions have struggled in this regard, and I know particularly one that's close to my home. They've done some work to really improve on that and build a closer alignment with the school district in terms of making sure that they're training teachers in a way that the district can actually move them into a classroom without remedial training, if you will. But is if you could just provide us a link to that. I mean, I know it's there, and I'm sure I
Absolutely.
could dig around and find it, or my assistant could.
We had it in our
given long
slides, and
enough.
I was trying to pare back in the interest of time, but I'm happy to send that to you. That's something that we're both proud of and do agree is critically important in terms of understanding the pipeline and the training that teachers and leaders are getting as they come into the school system. We've worked over the last couple of years with an advisory council that's comprised of, members of the educator prep programs, but also districts and other perspectives to try to really challenge ourselves as a state to use the data that we have as effectively as possible to understand what institutions are preparing teachers effectively and where are they falling short and how are we making sure to transparently report on that so that we can both learn from the high flyers, but also hold accountable all of our programs in this really important work in terms of the pipeline.
And that's, I think, really important to me because we have institutions who do it well. So it doesn't seem to me that we need to be building a new, inventing a new wheel. We have a wheel out there that's working, and we could just have our other institutions replicate the positive things that are being done. So, Representative Miller, I believe you have a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Under your 2020 BEP Review Committee priorities, number 2, continued commitment to increase teachers' compensation. How do you do that? And before you answer that, I should have asked this question earlier to the Commissioner of Education, but the 42 million in the governor's budget, it says that it is an increase, which the governor in the state is providing that increase. But once those dollars are passed through to the LEAs, it's nothing mandatory to say that the teachers are supposed to receive in their check whatever that increase amounts to. So how are you making that commitment?
I'll defer to Nathan on this, but I would first say you're absolutely right. I mean, the BEP is not a spending plan. So it's not, it does, in this case, earmark the dollars for teacher compensation. So it has to go to teachers, but there's a whole lot of sort of, asterisks there in terms of if we're giving a quote unquote 4% raise, do teachers actually see a 4% raise? The answer is usually no, because there's more staff involved at the local level than are calculated as part of that increase. But Nathan, this is your area of expertise.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as far as the BEP goes, it goes towards, educator compensation. Now, whether your superintendent of school decides, okay, we're going to hire an additional teacher, or we're going to bring in an aide or something else, that's a local decision. That is a local decision. And of course, it's frustrating. But in terms of the BEP Review Committee and its role, so this is the place where the districts and I would say the stakeholders make their request of the General Assembly and make their request of the executive branch. Now, in the past, if you go back to 2014 and 13 and 12 and so on, a lot of times they would put very, very high dollar items in there and say, we want to see this much extra money spent. Now, the trouble is that if you were to do that every single year, you all would end up having to increase the sales tax by a penny all the time. And it didn't work out that well. So one thing that has worked out, if you take a look, especially around at your colleagues and at the administration, who have decided that they're going to put as much as possible that they could into educator compensation, I would say the folks on the BEP Review Committee recognize that. And so when they ask for a continued commitment, it's because there is a pretty good degree of faith that you all are going to continue doing what you have been doing, and that is to push educator compensation as a priority, both in this branch and from the executive branch.
Madam Chair, one other question quickly. In reference to the increase in 2 legal positions, and it's based on a 74% increase since 2018, 2019, 74%. And we can't blame COVID-19 on any of that. What is this increase? What does that indicate?
Yeah, and I was expecting that question. I'll defer to Angie. There was something unusual about that year from 18 to 2019, but we're still seeing a major uptick. But Angie, why don't you explain a little bit further those numbers and where we are now?
Sure. So the 74% increase was from 2018 to 2019. What happened in 2019 was there was a large focus from our team from 2018 to 2019 to reach out to districts to make sure that directors of schools knew that the General Assembly passed a law that said you have to report any educator who commits any kind of misconduct that would subject them to discipline under the rule. So this was a mandatory thing that they had to be doing. We did tons and tons of outreach to directors of schools to make sure that they were aware of that need to report. Larger districts, Shelby County and Metro Nashville schools realized that there was a backlog of cases that were not previously reported that should have been from prior years. So we saw a huge uptick in 2019. Specifically, Shelby County sent us about 164 reports that should have been previously reported to us, but they did basically an audit. So they did their due diligence of all of their misconduct, that any suspensions that they had or firings of teachers, and realized there were about 164 reports that they should have made that they didn't. So they sent those in. That's part of the increase. But even if you take out those 164 reports that we received from Shelby County, we're still up 30% over the prior year. From 2017 to 2018, we were up 16%. So we went up 16% from 17 to 18. If you take out the extra reports that Shelby County sent in 2019, we're still up 30%. So we doubled it. In 2020, obviously, due to COVID, we are down from what we saw in 2018. However, if you look at the 2 months, January and February of 2020, which were obviously pre-COVID, we were tracking to see an even more record number of reports. So in January of 2020, we saw 82 reports. And in February of 2020, we saw 64. Obviously, in March, schools closed. So if you look at March, we saw 36. In April, we saw 23. So we saw a dramatic drop off, obviously, once schools were closing, kids and teachers weren't in buildings. But we were tracking toward continuing to see that uptick in cases. And there's really nothing that suggests to us that once everyone is back to into buildings and we're back to a more normal school year, these cases are going to continue to roll in at a pretty good clip.
Representative Sparks is going to ask a very brief question, which is going to close us down.
This is my first question in 2 hours. Representative Miller had kind of had my question. I was just asking that 74% increase, how much of that correlates to mental health? I mean, to stress.
Oh, that's a hard one. Angie, I don't know if I mean, we certainly do categorize the cases that come in, and we send a quarterly report to our board about the types of cases that we handle. So that might be one way to look at it in terms of some of that, but it does run the gamut in terms of we see a lot of technology related communication infractions. That's certainly one that's been on the increase. But it's hard to pinpoint some of the mental health related root cause for that.
Are there areas, is there any resources for teachers to reach out to?
In terms of the discipline work, or just for mental health?
Just stress and that some of the things they're dealing with.
There are. I'm probably not the best one to tell you about all of those, but we could certainly work with our partners at the department. I know, given the focus as a state on mental health for children as well as for educators, particularly during the pandemic, there are a lot of new resources now too available to teachers. But in terms of specifics, I'd have to defer to them.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And I didn't intentionally tell a story, but we do have an additional question, and I think it's worth the time. You mentioned the increase, the technology-related increases. Can you help us understand exactly what those might include?
Angie, I'm going to let you take that.
So just so I'm clear, Angie Sanders again, can you clarify, are you talking about the increase in our budget for our case management system?
Sorry, no, I think you're talking about what I referenced around the technology. Maybe I should start. I'm sorry.
Yes, you said the
text-related, computer-related, all kinds of different
educator complaints.
Yes. Thank you for that clarification. So yes, in 2020, we were sort of in 2020 and 2021 blazing new ground with sort of a new category of educator discipline cases that we have not seen in the past, obviously due to there being a lot of virtual instruction happening. So we are trying, it sort of runs the gamut from educators not realizing that their camera was still on and in some manner of undress in front of the camera while the students obviously could still see them, or they were text messaging during a class and they didn't realize when they were sharing their screen that their text messages were showing up and they were saying things in those text messages that the students shouldn't have been seeing. Those are sort of some examples of the technology related challenges, some of the new ground that we're breaking, and sort of trying to figure out where the best tack is in terms of whether that's appropriate for licensure discipline or not. As you might imagine, these are usually first time offenses for some of these educators. These are technology challenges that they've never had to deal with. So we're trying to give grace where it seems appropriate.
But social media is the other part I would just add to that too. I mean, we see just a lot. I
yes.
think there's just a blurring of the lines often for educators of all ages, particularly our younger educators, though sometimes who've grown up in a world of social media and knowing the lines in terms of what's appropriate with students and what's not. We just see a lot of that come through.
Yeah. And that's every year. That's not new to us, unfortunately.
All right, well, there may be other questions from this group, and if so, we will collect them and forward them to you and share with the committee as a whole. But thank you for hanging in with us late on this afternoon. We appreciate your time, and we appreciate the information that you provided. Most of all, we appreciate the oversight, the licensure of teachers and determining how those teachers are prepared, or, as I said, critical things for the future of the state. So you all do play a critical role, and we just want you to know that we appreciate that. And sorry that we're not the federal government and we can't just shower you with funds. Thank you.
Thank you.
This completes our calendar for today. Is there any other business? Any personal announcements? If not, we stand adjourned.